Hello everybody, and welcome to the February edition of the iTwin Platform Developer Webinar Series. My name is Jason Slocum. I'm a product manager for Bentley's iTwin Platform, and I'll be your moderator today. Today, we're going to be talking about creating and sharing insights with the iTwin Platform. I'm excited to be joined by Kostab Pagay and Arnav Malik, who are going to be leading you through today's session. We're going to kick off with Kostab providing an overview of our reporting capabilities. And then he's going to turn it over to Arnav, who's going to be walking you through how to go in and set up reports, how to use the APIs for reporting, as well as show you some of the open source components that are available to help you with building your own reporting solutions. As a reminder, you can put your questions into the chat box that you see on your screen, and then at the end of the session, we'll be going through and answering all those questions. With that said, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Kostab to get started today. Kostab, over to you.
Hello everyone, welcome to today's webinar, Creating and Sharing Insights with iTwin Platform. I am Kostab Pagay. I work as Director of Product Management at iTwin Platform, and along with me, we have Arnav Malik, who works as Principal Software Engineer on the platform. Let's have a quick overview of the iTwin Platform. iTwin Platform consists of open source software components and platform services that allow you to create and maintain digital twin for the infrastructure project. iTwin Platform connects to various data sources ranging from engineering authoring tools to IoT sensor data. You can further enhance the data using various PaaS solutions on the platform. The aggregated and enhanced data then unlocks downstream use cases such as design performance reports, carbon footprint calculations, safety statistics, and many more. We at Bentley have been using iTwin Platform to build Bentley applications such as PlantSight, Synchro, Design Review, etc. With iTwin Platform, you can use the building blocks on top of which these Bentley applications are built to create your own application for digital twins. We have recently launched iModel.js 3.0, and soon we will be launching support for extensions where you can extend Bentley applications with your own solution. Now, let's focus on engineering data in iTwin. The data can generate from various authoring tools. We support more than 35 applications and file formats, including Bentley and competitors' product, along with many industry interchangeable formats. These changes get stored in a specialized data container called an iModel. These design changes are stored as a change ledger, allow us to move to any previous project state. Looking at the data maturity, we started the data journey in the digital twin with raw engineering data. This is bronze level data. Through iTwin Platform synchronization service, we normalize the data greatly using the BIS schema. At this stage, it is queryable using EC-SQL. EC-SQL is SQLite query flavor for an iModel. Still, this is a silver level data because even after normalization process, there are project-specific schemas that can throw a wrench in creating the digital twin level aggregated reports. So to generate meaningful insights, we need to aggregate the data at the right level. For example, to generate embodied carbon calculation report, you need to get the quantity takeoff report aggregated at a different materials level. Today, Arnav will demonstrate how the reporting service in iTwin Platform can easily create different data views, auto-calculate missing properties, and many more ease-of-life features leading to business-level aggregated reports. Also, how easily the reports generated using iTwin Platform can be consumed in your application or Microsoft Excel or Power BI. So to demonstrate this further, I'll be handing over to my colleague Arnav. Thank you.
Thanks, Kostab, for the great introduction, and thank you viewers for tuning in to learn about the iTwin reporting platform. We will start with a detailed overview of key reporting concepts. Then we will explore various techniques to export and consume data from the iTwin reporting platform. Next, we will take a look at the API documentation. And finally, wrap up with a demonstration of how to leverage our open source UI components to integrate reporting into your iTwin workflows. All right, so let's get started. The best way for us to learn about the key concepts of the reporting platform will be for us to jump right into a live application and take a look at real-life examples of all the components that are required to set up and configure a report on the iTwin reporting platform. The first concept for us to cover are mappings and groups. Mappings are essentially an abstract container for groups, and a group is a collection of elements from the iModel. Now, the way I like to think of mappings are as a view of the iModel or some representation of the data that you want to see output as a report. So in my mock iModel that I have here, I created a mapping called seating. And in that seating mapping, I've created 4 groups. If you look carefully at this model, you can see that there are 4 different colors of chairs. I created 4 groups: yellow chairs, red chairs, green chairs, and blue chairs. And as you can imagine, as the name suggests, each of these consist of the colored chairs that match the color that I have decorated them with. Now, suppose that you're interested in calculating the total cost of all the chairs in this stadium. And let's add another hypothetical on top of that. Let's suppose that each of these chairs, for whatever reason, are constructed out of a different material, maybe different clientele, or something like that. And because each chair is constructed of a different material, as you can imagine, if we want to calculate the total cost for everything in this iModel, there's going to be a different factor to apply for each different type of chair. Now, so we have a mapping called seating, and we have 4 groups called yellow chairs, red chairs, green chairs, and blue chairs. The other thing about groups that's important to point out is how are they defined? How does the reporting platform store the definition of what makes up all the red chairs, what makes up all the yellow chairs, and so on? So if I jump into one of these, go back to red chairs like we were looking at before, I will show you this. So each group that I created, these 4, every single one in this mapping is defined by an EC SQL query, and that is going to hold true for all the groups that you create using the reporting platform. Every single collection of elements from the iModel must be defined by an EC SQL query. Now, the complexity of the EC SQL query is completely up to you. What we're seeing here is a relatively simple example, but EC SQL queries to capture more nuanced subsets of the data from your iModel can easily be much larger than I can show on the screen currently. And for your purposes, if you are experienced with EC SQL, you feel comfortable with it, please feel free to use our APIs directly and build groups yourself. We have, and I'll cover this a little bit later, but we have some tooling and UI to help unexperienced users with EC SQL create groups in an interactive fashion as well. But very important detail is that groups at their core are each defined by an EC SQL statement. Okay, so we've covered mappings and we've covered groups. Now let's talk about properties. So properties is how you tell the reporting platform for each group what properties to extract for each instance in that group. So here you can see for red chairs, I've defined 4 properties, one called color, one called volume, one called density, and one called weight. And you'll notice that there are 3 different categories of properties that you can define in the reporting platform. And they all serve 3 very different purposes. So we'll start with the top, the simplest. In our documentation, you'll see this referred to as either group property or property. And what group properties are properties directly derived from data on the iModel itself, on the instances, properties defined on the instances in the iModel. So if we dive into color, we can take a look at kind of what's going on here. We have some basic metadata, property name, data type, quantity type. This is shared across all of the other property types in the reporting platform. But what's interesting in the group property is the mapping system. Now here, if we take a look on the properties available on these red chairs, we're looking for color. So color is provided, we can find color on the user label, we can also kind of find color on the category. So here in this group property I've defined, I've said for color, go ahead and extract the value from user label. And what we can do on top of this is actually define some fallbacks as well. So I didn't do this earlier, but if for some reason there are some chairs that are missing a value, it's null or undefined for user label, we can tell it, go ahead and fall back to category. And pick that value from category instead if you can't find the value on user label. Now, all the documentation for group properties can be found in our API documentation. So if I go into mappings, create group property, and here we can see full details on how that ordering works for which group to pick or which property mapping to pick first. There's also documentation on some more advanced structures for how to define property mappings as well. And several really good examples for how those property mappings are resolved. Next, let's talk about the calculated properties. So calculated properties are not taken directly from the properties of the instance on the iModel, but rather derived from the geometry of the instance. So we can derive length, or an approximation of length, we can derive area, and we can derive volume. We can also derive properties that are based on the bounding box of the object. So the longest edge length, and so on. All the other possible combinations of coordinates that you might want to pick out of the bounding box are made available as well. The final property type is called custom calculation. And custom calculation allows you to define a custom formula that uses a combination of constants, other properties as variables, and a set of library functions that are defined in our documentation over here. Now, with custom calculations, the way this works is that when the data is being extracted from the iModel, we will evaluate these functions and then save a value to the property that you defined. And you'll notice here that the custom calculations are able to reference other custom calculations. So long as there isn't a circular reference, we will be able to resolve the order of operations. In this case, we'll calculate density first, which is just a constant value, and then calculate weight, which is derived from density times the calculated property volume. Now, if I hop back to my blue chairs, I think I have a better example, or a more interesting example, let's say, of a custom calculation. Yeah, over here, it isn't really doing much, but you can see the syntax as it's defined for using the function min, which takes in 2 arguments, the function square root, which takes in 1, to calculate the value of density. Now, if you recall, earlier I defined this mapping called seating with the intention to calculate some sort of a quantity or report about the seating in the stadium. And we've been talking about cost. So let's say that the cost is based on weight, and we're talking about each of these colors having some impact on the cost. So what I have done here is specify a different value, a different constant for density on each of these seats. And if you recall from the actual properties of each of these seats, there is no mention of volume, there's no mention of density or weight or anything. There are no numeric properties whatsoever. But with the reporting platform, I'm able to use the calculated property to extract volume. I'm able to use a custom calculation to define a constant for density. And with these two things, I'm able to calculate a weight using volume and density. And in our hypothetical case, we use the weight, we multiply that by something, and we create a total cost. Or we can create the sum of the weight of all the chairs in the model, or really whatever else you want to derive from the values that you've extracted. All right, so mappings, groups, properties covered. Now we need to talk about how to take all of that, turn it into a report, and make that data available for you to do things with. So to go through that, I'm actually going to jump back to our documentation and go through the set of APIs under the reports category. The two entities to focus on here are reports and report mappings. So a report, we'll go take a quick look over here at the payload. A report is the way you expose data out of the iTwin reporting platform. And a report is scoped to a project ID, iTwin ID, and any external application that you want to use to consume the data, views, or mappings that you've created in the reporting platform needs to first be bundled in a report. Now, how do you bundle data into a report? That's where we get into report mappings. Report mappings say that in this particular report, I want to associate the data for this mapping. And whatever mapping must also belong to an iModel. That iModel must belong to the context project iTwin ID of the report. An important thing to note here is that reports and mappings have a many-to-many relationship. You can have multiple mappings assigned to a report, and you can also assign a particular mapping to multiple reports, so long as they're within the same scope, within the same project context iTwin scope. With reports and mappings assigned to reports, the next order of business is to run an extraction. Extractions are scoped within an iModel. So what that means is that when you run an extraction for an iModel, all the mappings associated with that iModel will have its corresponding groups and properties extracted. And that information will then be available for any report that is exposing those mappings. Now, one important thing to note about the run extraction step, if you have an iModel that has not had an extraction run yet and has not had a mapping created yet, but you create a mapping, you've created your groups and so on, and you want to extract the data, you do have to explicitly execute the run extraction operation. Now, if you already have an iModel and that iModel has already been extracted in the past and a new change set is created for that iModel, in that case, the reporting backend will automatically extract and update the data for the new change set based on the existing mapping. So be mindful of that. It's not necessary to re-extract data with a new change set if that model already has an existing reporting setup. Now, finally, with all of that done, the final step to be able to consume the data in your report, which has now been extracted, is to use the data access endpoints. All of these endpoints are OData v4 compliant endpoints and are out-of-the-box consumable by products like Power BI, Excel, and any application that you write that is OData compliant. Authentication is interesting for the OData endpoints because we support two different authentication schemes. First, we have bearer token. This is what you should be familiar with across all the other iTwin platform API endpoints, or at least most of them. And the other scheme is a basic authentication. We also have a mechanism to generate an API key on the developer portal website and use that for authentication in third-party applications. This is actually crucial because in applications like Excel and Power BI, you don't have the mechanism to sign in using the Bentley client credentials as you would on a normal application or on a regular web application or something where you have more flexibility. So we have this API key mechanism to support those workflows. Now, to demonstrate that and walk us through how that looks, how to create an API key and whatnot, I'm actually going to hop back to our live demo, and I'm going to use a new iModel and use this opportunity to demonstrate the copy mapping feature. We've gone through so much to get to this point, and you must be wondering, well, do I have to do this every time? Every new model, every new mapping, do I have to go and run a script or manually configure these mappings every time? And that's definitely not the case. We do have an API endpoint. If we hop back over here, under mappings, copy mapping, it's very straightforward. You copy a mapping from another iModel over into the active iModel. And I'm going to go ahead and do that real quick for the model that we were looking at previously. Grab the seeding, rename it back to seeding, and import. That's done. And take a look at our imported mapping. It should look quite familiar. If I go and select the red chairs, we should see that the stadium model, which is the same model, it's just a clone of it in another project, should respond appropriately and highlight our red chairs as soon as everything loads in. And there we have it. All right, let's extract this data. So I'm going back to the developer portal. I'm going to be simulating this workflow through the developer portal, but I highly encourage you to write your own applications to make these API calls in an automated fashion. Now, let's jump back down to our reports and let's create a new report. I'm going to give it a name, reporting webinar, give it some description, and fill in the project iTwin ID for our model. Now, we execute, and out of this, we should get a report ID. Now, with this report ID, I'm going to create a report mapping. Now, over here, let's input our report ID, and we have our iModel ID, and we're missing the mapping ID, so let's go and fetch that. So to get our mapping ID, we can use get mappings for this particular iModel. We try it out, pass in our iModel ID, and execute. And we are looking for mapping called seedings. All right, here's our mapping ID. Grab that, jump back over here, and paste that in, and execute. So now we have our mapping assigned to our report. Excellent. So, next step, run the extraction, hit try it out, rise, get our iModel ID, paste it in there. There's no request body for this, and execute, and you should be returned with a job ID or run ID. We can use this to track the status. So, put in the job ID, go back and grab our iModel ID, and execute. And this will run within a couple minutes. So while this is running, I'm actually going to hop on over to the API keys UI. Now, in this UI, in order to create an API key, you are required to do this through the UI. So you go and click Create API Key. I'm going to create a new key called Reporting Webinar Key. I'm going to give it an expiry very soon and attach a report to it. Now, reports are attached through projects, as we discussed earlier. Each report is associated with a project. So if I go and grab the project, I should now be able to find my report. So if I just search for webinar, I think we should find our candidate. Looks like I might have made one before. Let's add both of them. Now we have our report added. So I'm going to click Save. And there you go. In this moment, we will see an API key spit out on the screen. And this is the only time you're going to see the key. So make sure to copy it and put it somewhere safe. Once you have that, let's come back over here and check the status of our extraction. Still running. This iModel has a lot of things in it, so it might take a little bit to complete. All right, let's see if we're done. Succeeded, completed, great. So let's close out of this. And now that we have our data extracted, we have our API key ready to go, let's move into Power BI. Okay, with Power BI open, select Get Data, go to OData Feed, and it will ask you for a URL. The URL you want to use is the OData endpoint through the reporting platform with the report ID that you're interested in at the end. Click OK, and then it will ask for authentication. We use basic authentication. That is the authentication scheme that is required to use the API keys. So username OData, password is the API key that was created that has access to view the report that we're interested in. And then for which level, select the lowest level. The reason I select the lowest level is because if you recall, an API key can have access to view data for more than one report. And in order to keep the noise low and just to see the data that's associated with the report I care about, I select this level. So click Connect. And then you'll recall, so that report that we're looking at, I assigned one mapping to it, and that one mapping had 4 groups. And for those 4 groups, we see 4 tables. So we can take a look at one of these tables. Over here, this is all the data that was exported from the iModel. There are 5 hard-coded columns that are always provided: EC instance ID, EC class ID, user label, bounding box low, and bounding box high. And there are the 4 properties that I added myself to be extracted. You notice that color is null. That's because it's redundant with user label. But the interesting ones, the cool ones, are volume, density, and weight. So volume, if you recall, this was calculated. There were no properties on the iModel that actually gave a volume, but we have a number here regardless. Density was a hard-coded value, or rather, density was a formula that I had evaluate to the hard-coded value of 2.75. And then weight is calculated based on volume and density. And all of this was done on the reporting backend when we exported the data. So it's as easy as that. If you're interested in all of the data, select all of them, click Load, and then you're free to do whatever you wish. We talked about using the weight to calculate some sort of a total cost. You could get the total number of each of the colors of chairs, or whatever your business requirements are. Okay. Closing thoughts on usage of the APIs. I'd like to specifically draw your attention to the authorization section of each of these API endpoints. Please be mindful about the Insights view and Insights modify permissions that are required. If I jump over to Create Report, you'll see Insights modify over here. These permissions are required for the full workflow. If you go and try to go through this exercise with an iModel you created over on the iTwin.js sample iModel page, you may have some difficulty because you might not be able to assign these permissions to yourself right away. So do be mindful about that, but this should not be a problem for non-trial scenarios. Now, you might be wondering, what was that UI I used throughout this webinar to demonstrate the components and fundamentals of the reporting platform? Certainly that UI can greatly assist with the complexity of setting up mappings, groups, properties, and so on. Help users, your users, set up reports without having to have intimate knowledge of the APIs. I'm happy to say that that entire UI widget, the panel on the left side of the viewer, is an open source component that you are free to use and include in your iTwin viewer applications. I'll go over a really quick demonstration of the requirements to run the widget and the setup in your iTwin viewer application, so stay tuned. To keep things simple, I'm going to be using the standard getting started template tutorial that many of you may be familiar with. All right, so we start off creating our new application with the Create React App template. I'm going to call mine Reporting Webinar Live, and let's let that go. This will take a little bit. All right, we've got everything set up. Now let's jump into our new project folder. And let's install the grouping and mapping package. Excellent. Now, with that installed, we have to do our environment configuration. I'm just going to copy what I had before, but the important thing for us to see here is the list of required scopes. I'm going to show us this list again on the developer portal configuration page, but just take a note of this. Now, in order to actually include the grouping and mapping widget in your application, go to your code where you have the viewer component initialized, and in here, add another attribute, UI providers, instantiate a new array with one object or more, or add one if you already have this. And if I allow my auto imports to go through, there you have it, new grouping and mapping provider. Let's scroll back up to the top. You'll see this line that was added, import grouping and mapping provider from the widget. And that is all you'd need. And the final step will be to run the application. While that's starting up, let's take a quick look at the scopes in greater detail. So here, you see the list of scopes that are required for our single page application client to run the grouping and mapping widget. In particular, projects read, insights read, insights modify. And all of this is documented in our GitHub documentation as well. But back over here, just for cross-reference, this is what you need. All right, my app is not working. It probably would help if I actually saved all of my changes. There we go. Since I didn't save my environment file, let me go ahead and relaunch, and let's wait again. All right, and with that, there we have it. We have a running iTwin viewer application with the grouping and mapping widget included. So a couple details that I did not touch on when I first went through the overview of the reporting platform. Everything that you may need to do with mappings, groups, and properties can pretty much be handled through this UI. The UI definitely facilitates a lot of the more difficult aspects of the API, and I encourage you to build your applications around the UI. Over here for mappings, obvious button to create a new mapping. Not very much depth here, just a name and a description. Deleting entities are done through the submenu. We already talked about how to copy mappings across iModels. If I dive into the group level, same thing, delete through the submenu. Adding a group is actually somewhat interesting. So when creating a group, the process is highly interactive. So if I were to create a new group, and let's say I want to capture all of these interesting support beams on the roof of the stadium, you expand out the menus, and the workflow is as such. You basically want to select what properties to expand your selection based on. So looking at these, they look to be some sort of interesting triangular beam. So maybe if I tick the triangular beam, let's see what happens. And there you go. It's as easy as that to select all of these roof sections, these roof steel beam sections, and create a group out of it. And click save, and there you go. Group is created. If I wanted to make another one, maybe I'm interested in the stairs. Go in here, select the stairs, take a look at what properties I have for stairs. I see material concrete, I see grade, I see concrete ratio. Maybe I want to do it by pitch. So let's see. What selection? Okay, so there we go. These are all the stairs in this model that are set by this pitch. Click save, and there you go. You have another group with the same name. But that basically covers it. There are going to be some scenarios where in the current state of the grouping and mapping widget UI, some queries, so if I drill into this, some of the queries that you can create using the UI will not fully capture your requirements. And there may be some cases where you'll need to go and manually define a query using the APIs, but those scenarios should be fairly rare. In general, the UI should be able to handle most of your use cases, and we're constantly improving the UI to capture more and more complex scenarios. And that's it. Thank you so much for your attention through this long and winded presentation. I'd like to drop a link real quick to our GitHub repository. We're very much so open to feedback and requests for help. So please don't hesitate to reach out. And best of luck with your endeavors using the iTwin platform. Thank you.